Hi, everyone. This is Dean West. I'm president of Association Laboratory. And believe it or not, this is the 25th anniversary of the founding of Association Laboratory. I started the company next week, 25 years ago, out of my condo in Chicago. And it's been quite a ride. We've had a lot of fun. And to celebrate our 25th year, what we wanted to do, frankly, is get 25 super smart people on Zoom and ask them about the changing nature of leadership and maybe lessons they've learned over time and things I think we're going to have to deal with moving forward. And of course, joining me today is one of the smarter ones we get to talk to. Vicki Loise is head of SLAS. I'm going to make her say what SLAS is, by the way, because I always forget the last S when I talk about the acronym. And she is legitimately one of the keenest strategists in the association sector. I've had the pleasure of working with her and knowing her for some time now, and excited to hear what she has to say about leadership in associations. Vicki, why don't you give us a quick intro and remind me what the final S of SLAS is?
I sure will. Thank you, Dean, and happy 25th
Thank you very
anniversary.
much.
So SLAS is the Society for Laboratory Automation and Screening. Uh,
Screening, that's it. I always forget
yeah,
screening.
it is. Yes. And as you said, I'm the CEO for SLAS. I've been here for just over 7 years, and it's a wonderful, great place to be.
Well, you run a good shop. I've always enjoyed working with you folks and your team. Before we got on this interview, it was kind of fun. I was talking about how I introduced Association Laboratory 25 years ago by sending a broadcast fax, which was the
Yeah.
technology of the time. And when I think of, I used earlier today, I used ChatGPT to help me with the report I was writing. When I think of like the innovations that have happened over the last 20 years, it's pretty amazing. So when you think about
Mhm.
like the next 25 years, if you and I got transported 25 years into the future and looked back at the leadership of associations, what do you think the biggest changes we'd see? What would be disruptive? What would be beneficial? What do you think they would look like 25 years from now?
I think and maybe this is more of a hope, but I would really like to see 25 years from now, leadership in associations younger and maybe not necessarily taking the traditional path that you and I saw 25 years
Okay.
ago, and sometimes even still today. Whether it's on the volunteer side or the staffing side, where on the volunteer side, you need to start in a small committee role, or
Yeah. It's
maybe
all very
you
linear,
get,
isn't it? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're a student and you get a travel award to come to the conference, and
Yeah.
then you're on a committee, and then you're on another committee, and then you get to chair a committee, and then you're on a something else before you can even be considered for a board role or some
Okay.
other major leadership role. On this, I would really like to see it be more about what are the skill sets that are best for the society. And of course, you always want to make sure that you've got people in leadership roles who understand the
Sure.
society, but that doesn't necessarily have to take 10 years
Yeah.
of volunteer time. It can take a couple, maybe. Or maybe there are different ways that we as associations can be cultivating those leaders so that they have that understanding faster. So that's something that I would really hope that we can see 25 years from now.
So thinking of that
Um,
as a CEO, real
yeah.
quick on that, just to expand on that, how
Mhm.
does that change the nature of leadership as a CEO? If you had to, or is it different
You mean as a from a staff side,
Yeah,
not so
from
much
the
from the
staff side?
volunteer
Yeah,
side.
correct.
Um, so I think as a CEO, we have to do is change our mindset again about not having to go through that traditional path and investing time in the cultivation portion of things.
Okay.
Really changing how we spend time with volunteers or potential volunteers. And what does that time look like? We're busy as CEOs, and so often at conferences we're getting to say a quick hi to somebody or a handshake, or maybe you even have the luxury to finish a cup of coffee with someone. We have to restructure how we spend our time when we have those volunteer interactions so that we can speed up that cultivation time that I was talking
Okay.
about.
What's an
Yeah.
example of how someone might do that? If you
Oh,
hire,
that's such a
if
great
I got
question.
my CEO job tomorrow because I was sick running my own company, like a real CEO job where I got money and fame, status.
Mhm.
Like how would I manage my time differently as a CEO?
I think so. One of the experiences that I've had recently has been I have a new secretary who's on our board of directors, and he's not new to the society at all, but it's been a
Sure.
long time since he's um, done some significant volunteer work. And so whenever he and I are on a call for something else, so let's say it's an executive committee call or something like that, we carve out an extra 10 minutes afterwards for us to just go through anything he wants to talk about.
Okay.
His time is precious. My time is precious. And so, I mean, this isn't rocket science that we're talking about here. But before the last conversation we had, he had actually read the entire bylaws,
Wow.
start to finish, read every word, and had questions and had really good questions, not
Sure.
just about, the legality of bylaws, but about how we function and why we do things the way we do. Not necessarily to, turn upend everything, but he really just needed to have the understanding.
Yeah.
And
Just to
it
understand the system within which they had
Yeah,
to
and it
operate
caused
also. Yeah.
me to rethink some things. I mean, quite honestly, I don't read the bylaws that frequently, certainly not cover to cover. And so I had to take a moment and say, you know what, you're right. We don't have to do this way anymore, and we can change the bylaws and we can change a policy. It's again not rocket science. So,
Yeah.
that's just one example, and it's forced me as a CEO to not just keep going through my everyday regular day, but kind of step back and think very differently about what are those governance things that are in place that might be getting in our way, and how do you
Let,
change them?
let's expand on that a little bit, Vicki, because we've had a couple experiences with that recently, where organizations have wanted to make relatively substantial change in how they operate, to be more agile in how they make decisions,
Mhm.
things of that nature, but have been restricted by a bylaws modification process that literally took years and
Mhm.
had to be approved by people with very little daily knowledge of the association itself. So, one of our clients, for example, every 2 years, they get an opportunity to change bylaws. They can't change the price of their membership until those bylaws are changed.
Yeah.
Another one we worked with looked at their governance process as an inclusionary strategy that as a result of how their kind of path to leadership was structured, it inadvertently favored people who had time and money. And so their top leadership entity had people who were semi retired and rich. But there wasn't a lot of representation. People had a spouse or kids or were more active in their practice. This was a healthcare group. So, how do you kind of balance that kind of structural limitations of governance with the necessity of modern day leadership?
I hear stories about this all the time now, and
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
very fortunate here at SLAS where we don't have, we don't have a House of Delegates. Our bylaws are really, I would say, very contemporary and provide a lot of flexibility in decision making. So things like dues prices are not in
Sure.
there. The bylaws can be changed by the board. You don't have to have a full membership vote, that kind of thing. Now, I've worked for organizations where that wasn't the case and had to go through that process of
Yeah,
change. And there's one word that makes that work, and it's trust. And from trust, you have to have things like transparency and open and honest conversations to get to that place of being a more flexible, dare I say, nimble association. You have to take all those barriers out. The only way you're going to be able to do that is to figure out a way to build that sense of trust amongst your volunteers and your volunteer leadership, and at the same time still give them the feeling that they are contributing in a significant way. I sometimes think volunteer leaders find it easier to look to those things of, oh, this is the bylaws review here, yeah,
oh
we're
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
we're gonna dig in, and that's where they feel value because it's so tangible.
yeah,
So if you can find ways to make sure that they still feel valued as a leader, but also that they feel like they can see it and touch it and see the outcome of their work as a leader, that
sure.
isn't getting in your way as an association and isn't slowing things down.
I agree. Trust is a big issue. Here's where we've kind of seen this played out with some of the organizations we work with, which is in one scenario there was no trust. So
Right.
a broader core of members distrusted decisions made by the board of directors, and as a result, didn't want the board to have more power. But another issue really was a membership. And when I say membership, it's a kind of a broader core of volunteer leaders, less kind of central decision making. It was less about trust and more about I say the word representation, but they
Mm.
felt that the decisions were being made farther and farther away from the membership, and the membership had a responsibility to participate in ways they had historically, and it kept the decisions close to the everyday member. So it wasn't that they distrusted the board; it's that they were concerned that a more separate decision making body would somehow, not through malicious intent, but wouldn't make good decisions or decisions that were directly related to the membership. So how do you kind of
Mhm.
balance that trade off as a CEO?
That's an excellent question, and I think a really legitimate concern of those members. And I mean, if you think about it in our own US political system, we
Sure.
feel often the same way as individuals that the people in Washington, D.C. aren't representing
Yeah, just don't
our
understand
individual
you on a daily
interests.
basis. Sure.
Yeah. Even though that might be their job, but they,
Yeah.
somehow there's too much distance and things get lost. So
Yeah.
that's a really tough one to overcome. I think a lot of it is back to transparency and over communication with those members, and giving them a forum to talk with the
Okay.
leaders, giving them a place to have some kind of interaction, however you want to do that. If you
Yeah.
want to
Almost
set up
creating a
virtual
feedback.
calls
Yeah,
or,
like a creating a
yeah,
feedback loop almost. Yeah.
yeah. I think as long as an individual always has an opportunity to make their thoughts and feelings known, then you're going to be more successful at closing that gap that you just
Sure.
described between the members' needs and the members feeling like the leaders are addressing their needs. So just you give them an opportunity to give them a forum, and you're gonna have more success.
In one of our earlier interviews, probably a month and a half ago, the CEO we spoke to, Joel, was talking about how really one of the both enjoyable and difficult positions of a modern day association CEO is you basically operate in multiple leadership environments. You have your
Mhm.
staff team where you have both implicit, explicit hierarchies. You've got your board where some people look at it servant leadership, and the board really has a more directive role. Others look at it as a partnership between the CEO and the board. And I've really seen that evolve over the last 25 years. You've got volunteers that are technically kind of beneath the CEO in terms of hierarchy, but members are members and volunteers are volunteers. So you have all these different circles that you'd have to navigate. As a CEO, is that a fair characterization? And if so, how do you balance that? How do you navigate that as a successful CEO?
Well, it is fair, and let's not forget you're completely alone in all
Yeah,
of those circles.
that's a
Um,
great point.
yeah, I mean, there are times where there are just things you can't go to one of your senior team members and say, "Oh my
Sure.
gosh, I really need to vent about this." That's sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. And
Yeah. Yeah.
likewise with any of those other groups you're talking about. So, um, from that standpoint, I think it's important to have some type of a cohort or friend group or whatever that is working in a similar role to what you're working in, so
Sure.
that you do have a place to sort of release that valve every now and then and get some feedback and get a check-in that no, you're not crazy. That was an unusual situation, and
Yeah.
it's difficult to do sitting in the CEO chair. Um, as far as navigating amongst all of those sort of stakeholder groups, I think the most important thing for me is to remind myself why I'm doing this, and
Okay.
why I'm doing this is to support the mission and the vision of SLAS. So the conversation might have a little bit of a twist depending on who I'm speaking with or who is speaking to me. Um, but the outcome always has to be the same. And that has come in handy in a lot of decision-making things, especially
Okay.
some of the more difficult and ugly decisions
Yeah,
that have to be made is you have to kind of take the emotion out of it for a minute and really just hone in almost a clinical way of what is the best thing for the organization, what gets
sure.
us to our goals, our place of growth, whatever the case is. Um, and if you try and stay in that lane, then I think it makes it easier to sort of navigate in and out of those stakeholder
Yeah.
circles.
You know, and a technique I've used with my team, we do really have what I would call angry interactions where people are angry at
Mhm.
us, but there's often a lot of tension because, half the board wants A and the other half wants B, and we're trying to navigate that. And it can be very emotional. And my advice to my own team has been, if someone's angry or yelling at you or upset for whatever reason, it's just information. It's
Yeah,
not about you. So that they're upset about a thing. It has nothing to do with you and your performance or stuff like that.
right.
It's their decision coming out on that. And I like that kind of clinical kind of stepping yourself out of that situation and just
Hmm.
absorbing the information you're getting, because you have to protect yourself again, but you're by yourself. You have to
Hmm.
protect yourself from the environments, because otherwise you make bad decisions.
Right,
The person
exactly.
yelling at you gets what they want, and the person that's quiet does not, when the quiet person has the better idea, or the more, you know, better understanding of the situation, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The person yelling at you is always motivated by something that you don't know about, most
Yeah,
likely.
that's a great point. Yeah, that's a
Something
great
else has
point.
happened
Yep,
yesterday, a week ago, 6 years ago,
yep,
that's triggered an emotion in them.
yep,
And you're not going to know what it is. And
exactly right. No,
so you just have to accept that and let that anger just sort of wash off of you and get to the core of what is the issue that they're
yeah,
actually trying to discuss with you.
and then find someone else and take it out on them. I assume. Yell at your
Call a
dog or something.
break, call a
Yeah,
coffee break,
yeah,
and yeah.
yeah. Call somebody in and pretend to fire him just to get out of your system. Yeah, which is wrong. Viewers, don't do that.
No, don't
That's
do
that's
that. We
that's
do
bad.
not
That was
recommend
in
that.
satire.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a little bit about kind of how the structured leadership is changing. If we move forward 5, 10, 20 years, whatever we want to say, and look back, are there some things that we do today you think will be obsolete? Things you'll just, again, you and I joked a little bit on the front end
Mhm.
about how I announced the company, and we had a very aggressive direct fax program, and we faxed press releases, and we faxed, and you faxed them
Mhm.
back to us. I still have
Oh,
a
yeah.
copy of the contact thing, and I can't remember the last. I don't even know if we've got a fax number. I don't know what it is. I think you could still fax us something, but I can't remember the
Mhm.
last time I faxed something. I'm not so much about technology per se, but what do you think is going to be obsolete in an association 10, 15 years from now?
It's funny you say that. I'm not sure I know what our fax number is either. I know we have one.
I think it's on
But
our card, but I honestly
yeah,
don't.
I have to look it up on our card too, and the rare occasions I'm asked for
Yeah,
it. Um, Likewise, along with those lines, I was saying to my assistant a little while ago, I said, the only phone calls I answer on the phone that rings on my desk are from our lawyer. Like every other phone call that comes through is spam. Nobody calls
yeah,
us
yeah.
except for our lawyer.
That's a
So
great point. Yeah.
they're the only phone call I pick up.
That and my
Um,
spouse, my wife Martha, she calls me, I pick up because probably somebody's dead or I'm in trouble or something like
yeah,
that. Like those are the only two
yeah.
things. Yeah.
Uh, so I think that that's certainly basic communication is going to change and continue to evolve and change. I really do hope that it kind of comes back around a little bit and there is more personal face-to-face communication.
Sure.
In whatever it is, something quick and easy or something more complex that folks are setting up a Zoom call or picking up a phone instead of Slack or email. I mean, those are wonderful tools. I live by them. Um, but I certainly don't want to see us get too far away from face to face.
You know,
I think some of the other things, and I was reading something about this today, that I think this is going to be an interesting dynamic to see how this pans out. And that is associations not requiring college degrees for some positions anymore.
okay.
And we have this conversation within SLAS quite a bit because there are jobs in the laboratory automation world that do not require an undergraduate degree or a graduate
Sure.
degree. You could get somebody with an associate's degree or even with a certain amount of mechanical expertise.
Okay.
You could hire in a pharmaceutical lab to help run your equipment. And so I think looking beyond that bit of arrogance of, must have a 4-year college degree,
Yeah.
or even a master's degree for certain association positions, and opening things up a bit around, is that really necessary? And what are the skills you need? And how can people get those skills to take those jobs? The other point this article made, though, was to make sure then that the organization is willing to continue to invest in that individual to help with their skills development so that they can grow within the company and not
Sure.
get boxed into that one particular job. So I think that would be, I would really like to see how that dynamic plays out over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
I find that interesting too. It's almost impossible to find someone who knows how to be a consultant. And
Right.
and because consulting is about like applying your skill set in an efficient way. So they show up as a membership person or as a CEO or a meetings person, and they know how to do that. But what they don't know how to do is apply it for 10 different groups efficiently in kind of a
Mhm.
structured process. So actually, Gary LeBranch, it wasn't Gary LeBranch. Somebody told me this a couple of years ago that it basically takes you 2 years to get to break even on a consultant, 4 years before they know what they're doing. And I've actually discovered that's about right.
Mhm.
And so even for us as a small company, we've got a very kind of defined development track. We've got to teach you how to, here's why we serve clients the way we do. Here's why that's important. Here's what happens if things go wrong. Like it's just a lot to learn, completely
Mhm.
separate. And I'm wondering if you find it at the end of the day, it's just hard to get people who already know how to do the job. So you're looking for a basic skill set and a basic attitudinal check. They're willing to learn. So you give me somebody willing to learn, and I can teach you how to do consulting. It's the people who were set in their ways that were really difficult to work with. How do you navigate that as a leader?
One of the things that I've learned as a leader and as a person of the Gen X generation is
Woohoo!
that
Best generation.
the best generation for sure,
Call
um,
her.
is quite honestly, we've hired a lot of millennials and Gen Z lately. And while they didn't know anything about SLAS or our particular way of
Sure.
doing things, they brought a skill set in that we didn't have to train. We didn't have to spend any money on, and they could show us a thing or two, some of
Yeah.
us Gen Xers a thing or two. And so I think sort of opening things up to, okay, you're hiring a membership person, do they have to know IMUS or whatever your particular
Yeah. Whatever
AMS
your
is?
system is.
No,
Yeah.
they don't. If they have any kind of experience working with databases of any kind,
Yeah.
or quite frankly, have graduated from college or from high school in the last 5 years, they know more about playing in those databases than we do, quite honestly. So you really then just need to shift on what it is that
Sure.
you really need, and what can you train on. And you don't have to train on everything. And I think we can flip over what those needs are versus what we're willing to train on.
Let me ask you this question because it's kind of a segue into one of the big questions, which is one of the challenges I face with folks is particularly like things like strategic planning. You and I have worked with strategic planning. Your consultant has to be a peer with the board,
Yes.
and so you can't be subordinate to the board. And same for a CEO.
Right.
And because the minute they think you work for them, now you have to do what you're told. But a lot of people's career track is being subordinate to those volunteer entities. The member wanted it,
Mm.
so we did it, things of that nature. And so it's interesting when people have come to work for us, one of the first things I have to do is get them to not just do what they're told by the chairman of the board or some equivalent thing like that, because it's ingrained into them. How do you help your staff kind of overcome that natural deference to your volunteers? Or do you?
Um,
Maybe that's the question.
yeah, so that is a bit of a process. And you, first of all, as a leader, and not just the CEO, but whoever your
Sure.
top leadership level is, needs to be prepared to fight the fight. so that when you do get that volunteer who has decided they're going to do things are going to be done their way, period and stop, and everybody will listen to them and do it their way. You have to be willing to step in front of that person and say, this is not how this goes. And have those conversations with them. And I think when the rest of your staff sees that happening, they then start feeling safe and comfortable in at least bringing it to your attention when it happens. They may not feel safe and comfortable in confronting the volunteer at the level you do, but they will at least bring it to your attention instead of putting their head down
Yeah,
and
let
doing
it
whatever
simmer,
that
sure.
volunteer said. And maybe they do get to that point where they can challenge that person's thoughts a little bit, and ask the questions like, why is it that you think this is so important when it's a complete 180 from what we have planned in our
Yeah,
strategic plan or whatever it is? Why is it that you think your one point of view should guide everything that the organization does? Like
yeah.
I think if you start making them feel comfortable in asking those kinds of questions, um, then it makes it a little easier to address the more challenging folks.
Yeah. I think the other part of that too is if someone has a disagreement or wants to do something, is to listen openly as to why they disagree, because maybe they're right. And I saw a great
Mhm.
example of this with one of our healthcare clients in strategic planning. So we've been through our process, Vicki. So we've done the survey and we've done the retreat, and then we went through the draft of their executive committee, and we're at the final sign off. When the chairman of the board's leading the conversation, one of the members of the board said, we've got the draft up on a screen, and he's like, "What about this?" And we were all kind of like, holy crap, that's a good point. And
Mhm.
and we made changes. Like his perspective, and he wasn't really disagreeing with it. It was just he brought a different perspective. And to be, and the chairman, I was the same way. We could have fought it. And just because you want to get your document approved, that kind
Yes.
of becomes your goal. Like you've worked so hard to get the document approved, you don't want to change anything. But God forbid the guy had a good point. And
Yeah.
so we
Yeah.
changed it. And so it's hard to listen or understand that your role as a leader isn't to be right, to win the
Right.
cocktail party argument. Okay, your role is to listen to what other people's perspectives are and understand whether that's something you should take seriously.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you should have a reasonably good rationale for why you did.
Well, and I think that goes back to one of the things you were asking about, we were talking about earlier around the members feeling too distanced from the leaders.
Yeah,
If you do exactly what you just said, which is, you are just about to cross the finish line and somebody is yanking your shirt back, you need to let that happen.
yeah,
And when you do that, you do open yourself up to making sure that you've listened to all perspectives and hopefully are making decisions that are representative of your community.
and listen, and not just listen as a task. That you have to
Exactly.
check off, like you've ever done it. Let's talk a little bit on that kind of balance. You and I have seen over the years, again, that the historical model of the executive director
Mhm.
was servant leadership. And I've forgotten how many times I've been told about servant leadership when I was younger, and you support and you report to the board. It's the board's decision making, it's the members association. But we've really seen this evolve into the modern day chief executive officer that has much more of a leadership role in directing the association and taking
Mhm.
the lead on things, not simply waiting to be told what to do. How do you balance that back and forth as a CEO? Because they're both valid approaches, but how do you balance that?
Uh, I am very fortunate that the role I hold now is the latter that you described, but
Sure.
I've been in the former too. And uh, I was lucky. I walked into this role and that was already the culture of SLAS. So it wasn't a culture that I had to try and change. But what I have learned is in order to stay in that role, you almost have to over communicate with whoever it is that you directly work with on your board,
Sure.
whether it's a president or an executive committee or what have you. And sometimes just having really almost informal, casual discussions with them about things like,
Yeah.
not everything has to be very proper and like you're reading from a policy statement. Like
Yeah.
you can kind of let your hair down a little bit with them and say, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with this. Like I think as soon as they see you are a human being,
Yeah. Yeah.
And they might be dealing, maybe it's a weird volunteer challenge. They deal with personnel issues in their jobs too. So you might be able to share from their experience, or they might just be happy to be your sounding board.
Yeah.
Um, that's how I've learned in this position to be able to continue to lead, is because those volunteer leaders that I work with understand me, and they know what my style is and what my decision-making process is, what my
Yeah.
values are, what's important to me in my decision process. So the better they get to know me,
Yeah.
the easier that is.
I think that's a great point. I think a little bit of the reverse is also true. Not to say you wouldn't think that, but I think I took for granted for a long time how board members just showed up on the board, and you knew they're on the
Mm,
board. And I didn't really think of, I thought what they did with the association to get there. I hadn't necessarily thought about what they did in their work professional life. And so I remember years
yeah.
ago, I met the gentleman who was the project engineer for like the F-22 fighter. Like he was
Oh,
responsible for
wow.
building design. Yeah. And I'm like, that's a
Yeah.
bigger job than I've had.
Yes.
And you learn some
Or ever
lessons
will. Yeah.
you learn some lessons doing that. And I've met people who run huge firms and people who have traveled, when you think of all the people you interact with over the years in this profession, folks who've done a lot of substantial things, and they have
Mhm.
lessons to teach. And I found where they struggle sometimes is they suddenly found themselves dropped into a different leadership environment. It's not they don't have competencies or skills or knowledge, it's that they have to apply it in a different scenario. How do you help your board and your other volunteer leaders with that challenge?
You know what? I like to take advantage of that kind of thing,
Okay,
and not take advantage of them being challenged, but
understood. Sure.
tell me what that previous work life was or job was, and how did you operate in that setting of developing an F-22 fighter? Like,
Yeah.
they went to work every day, just like we go to work every day. But we glamorize the outcome. But they probably had a lot of really crappy days.
Yeah.
So I think if you can kind of learn from their experiences and find out, okay, well, how does that translate to now our work together here as a board? And there might be things, like you said, there are probably things that we can learn from those experiences. There might be better ways that we can do things, or have better insight to things. It's good practice for listening to people is when you sit down and ask them to tell you their story.
Sure.
It's great listening practice, and because it's fun.
I used to be a particularly bad listener, and I years ago, I'm up to average now, but I joke because this is a true story. I used to pretend to listen because pretending to listen was as useful as actually listening. And so I remember I had this mantra in my head. I'd sit there and like listen, listen, and I would hold eye contact. And if you were talking to
Mhm,
me, you thought I was listening, where I was already running through what I was going to do next in my head. I
mhm.
discovered by practicing that I actually became a better listener. So God
Oh,
forbid.
well, that's
So
good.
it's but I knew I would jump because you've worked even though I've known you a number of years. I'll jump on a sentence. I'll get ahead of
Mhm.
you. Or what about this? What about that? And I knew that was a mistake I was making, particularly with people who were just taking their time and being deliberative talking to me. And so I had to trick myself into being a better listener by just like shut up and just like,
Yeah,
clamp my mouth
just
shut
and
and listen.
actually
So
listen.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
there's
Well,
my
and I
there's my
think
leadership advice. Pretending to listen is probably as good as actually listening half the time. So
eventually,
yeah.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
that activity of turning off the brain wanting to respond while somebody's talking is incredibly challenging. That is
Yeah.
a hard skill to master. And I mean, I've been there too. I've had to do that as well. And you almost will always trip yourself up if you don't do that. If you don't shut that part of your brain down or just make it
Yeah.
be quiet for a bit, you're gonna respond to something that is not relevant,
Yeah.
or or you're gonna completely miss the thing that you were supposed to respond to. Um, SLAS is made up of a lot of scientists, all scientists actually,
Yeah.
and very, very smart people. And scientists want to answer the question. So very often I find as I am trying to go through and set up a situation, I often get interrupted because people think whatever I just said is the question to be answered. And so, being on the receiving end of that, I often have to do, I really appreciate that hang on with me for another minute because I'm going to get to the end and then we can talk about all this stuff. But the rest of this is just as important as what I just said. So just, hang in there. And they do. They're like, oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. But they just always, they want to answer all the questions right away. Be the first one.
One of my favorite lessons. I was my first job was I was the lobbyist for the Iowa Medical Society right after college. That was my first
Ooh,
association job. Yep, cold called to get it. So yeah, I know that interviewing crap. No one's ever tried to hire me, by the way. I cold called, I answered a rejection letter, and I started my own company. Those are my three jobs.
well, there you
Not a
go.
single person's ever tried to hire me. So that shows the wisdom that a lot of people bring to the table. But they had a House of Delegates at the Iowa Medical Society, and the contract lobbyist was James West, no relation, although my father was also named James West. And he was the also legal counsel. And so, you can picture the, theater seating, all the delegates from all over Iowa sitting
Mm-hmm.
there. And there was a question from the podium, got the executive committee. And I'll always remember this. It was about something related to the insurance code. So you have to understand, James West had been a lobbyist for 30 years at that point. He'd written the code.
Oh,
Okay.
wow. Yeah.
He worked for the big insurance companies as one of his clients. He absolutely knew what was in the code. He knew what it meant. He didn't need any time to think about it. But
Mm-hmm.
I'll remember this. He took the time. He just walked, everybody was watching him. He walked quietly all the way to the front to the mic. And then he pursed his lips like he's given it deep thought. And then he answered the question. But you could just see how he gathered himself to answer the question accurately, how he collected people's attention because other people were talking. You've been at meetings like that, and he drew all this
Mm-hmm.
attention to self, gave himself a chance to get set up and then answer it. And I've always loved that technique, and I've used it
Mm-hmm.
myself. Like, just stop, gather
Mm-hmm.
yourself, find an excuse to shuffle your papers, whatever you have to do, and then answer versus snap that answer off. And I think it
Yeah.
builds credibility with people that understand you're being thoughtful and you don't say anything stupid, which is a useful kind of
Right,
outcome as well.
because for all you know, he was walked on that walk to the microphone. He was thinking, I can't believe I have to answer the same damn question
Oh
again.
yeah,
And,
which is a big problem for a lot. Yeah,
for sure. And so he was probably like, okay, let's get ourselves into the right mode, the right brain set, and then answer. Yeah. I mean, I think that's great advice and a great tactic to use.
yeah. Kind of my last official question.
Mhm.
When you think of the evolving role of an association CEO and an association leader, how do you think our colleagues, or what do you think our colleagues should do to kind of ensure they remain relevant, that they continue to kind of support sustainable association business models? What's your advice to our colleagues on how to prosper over the next 5 to 10 years?
I would say be comfortable with experimentation and also be comfortable with failure because that's
Okay.
what comes with experimentation. So if you're going to take that risk to experiment with a new program or service or what have you, make sure you have those things in place, those mileposts in place or something so that you know when to pull the plug. So often we can get into that experiment mode, but we're too afraid as CEOs to say, you know what, this is not going to work. This is, or the way we've set it up is not going to work. And to go to our boards and leaders and say, this wasn't the right way to do this. Um, Everybody has to get comfortable with that mentality of failure in the context of how I just described it. And that includes the volunteer leaders too. I think you have to have that partnership with them so that they trust that you will pull the plug before things have gone too far. And then they have to not take your head off when you
Sure.
say this isn't going to work. But I fully believe in that. Again, I'm very fortunate to be in an environment where we can do that, but we don't just throw ideas out on a board and start doing them without a lot of background, a lot of research. And like I said, those metrics are mileposts so that we know what we should be hitting and when we should be hitting it. And if we're not, why? And we can either make adjustments or we stop. And we do that actually quite a lot. And it's great too, because that way too, when you have volunteers or members, I should say, come to you and say, you know, it would be so great if we had X, and we can say, you know, we tried X. And it failed miserably, and this is why, and this is how we got to this point. Is there something different that you think could happen that
Sure.
would make it successful? You know, and again, you have that great then sort of member interaction to understand their needs, and show them that you are always trying to be new and innovative along the way.
Well, I've clearly mastered the failure part, so I'm halfway there. But let's extend this a little bit. So we're working with a client right now that on their global expansion, and their board's going to like what we recommend. They're going to approve stuff. They've got their own ideas. It's all going to work this year. They're not going to know if the plan works 3 or 4 years from now, because it takes a long
Mhm,
time. You've done international expansion,
mhm,
and they're going to have a completely different board, and they're going to say, why the hell did we just spend all that money over the last 3 or 4 years? So how
right.
do you navigate your changing board and your changing board expectations on these strategies that are going to take, frankly, years to see if they work or not?
Yeah, well, again, it's all about communication and making sure that those newcomers to the board understand the thought process and the motivation that took place before they got there. We are doing the exact same thing right now. We are looking at our European growth and where it is and where we want it to go. And I wrote a growth strategy that's a 4-year growth strategy. And year 4, there's not a whole lot in there. And it,
Yeah,
because it blatantly says, we'll fill this
yeah,
in
yeah.
once we get
Depending
through
on
years 1 and 2.
circumstances, yeah,
Yeah, because the first part of the strategy is actually data gathering and asking
yeah,
that community what they need and want.
sure,
And so until we know that, I really have no idea what to do in year 4, because I don't know what the community wants. And so I think showing that things like that are sort of living, ever evolving
that's a great point.
activities,
Yeah, that you need a
you know,
feedback loop. You can't just
you need a
stop
feedback
and
loop.
yeah, yeah,
And so a board 2 years from now is going to be dealing with a very different scenario than what the board is dealing with today.
sure,
And they might want to turn things on their ear, and they might be right, because what if there's another pandemic? What if there's an
yeah.
economic crash? I mean, there's all
Technological
sorts, there could be
innovation,
something really
yeah,
small
take your thing.
that could
Yeah,
just turn things inside out. Um, so I think it's about communicating what's happened in the past and why, but then again, going back to that listening of, well, why should we do things differently than what we thought we were going to do? Does
yeah.
that make sense? Are there different circumstances?
That's helpful. I'll put that into bullet point number 4 in my report,
Yes.
in my reference.
In the report that you're doing
Something
for
like
them.
that.
Yeah.
But
Feel free to change your number 4 if you
yeah,
want
it'll
to. Yeah.
it's gonna be a paragraph by the time I get done writing it. But that's I like that. It'll be something as we adjust to the dynamic and environment and the changing circumstances facing the association will be critical to blah 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 blah. Yeah,
Oh,
that
that's
it'll
some
be.
fantastic
Oh yeah,
consultant
yeah,
speak right there.
yeah.
That's
Oh yeah.
excellent. Right
I'm
off the tongue. That's
don't
good.
even think about
Mhm.
it at this stage. Years ago, but so this goes back to my Iowa Medical Society job, and one of my jobs was to go out and talk to doctors, and basically I'd sit in their office and I go, what's happening? Like what
Mhm.
do you have concerns about? All that kind of stuff. And I remember then in my last year when I left, I was doing kind of my last round, and one of the doctors, these are all kind of legislative key contacts, had asked me a question. And I went into this because now I've been a lobbyist for 5 years. I've been a PAC director, all this kind of stuff. And I go into a response. He couldn't help but laugh. He goes, I remember when you first showed up here and you could answer a question directly. And so I had gotten the
Uh-huh.
passive language, well, there's a variety of circumstances, doctor,
Yes.
where there, yeah, as opposed to, I don't know. So
Right.
yeah, I sometime my wife has told me this. So like one of the best CFOs she ever worked with was someone who could just answer the question that he was
Mhm.
asked.
Yeah.
Hey, Vicki, we're getting towards the end of our official time. I know you're busy helping people cure disease and all this kind of stuff. Do you have any final lessons or advice or counsel for the folks who are going to watch this? It could be funny, it could be interesting, it could be serious. Your choice.
Hmm. I would say just don't get too wrapped up um in yourself. Like don't trip over yourself.
Yeah,
It's okay to fail. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to um wonder, if the scenario you just experienced was reality, or did you just have an out of body experience? Like, we're human beings, and we all got to this place as human beings and making mistakes and learning and doing great things along the way. So I would say just, don't get in the way of yourself.
It's a great ending point. Vicki, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for helping us celebrate our 25th year in business and giving your insights to the folks who will watch. For our happy little viewers, if you ever wonder any more about us, feel free to reach out and see the other videos we're putting together at www.associationallaboratory.com. And if you have any advice or comments for myself or Vicki, always feel free to email them to me. Everybody
Mhm.
have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean.